One of the least understood figures in Litvak and Vilna Jewish history is perhaps its most famous figure. That's a paradox. The Gaon of Vilna, der Vilna Gaon, Reb Eliyahu bereb Solomon Zalman. Now, in order to understand the Gaon of Vilna's greatness, one has to do something very difficult. One has to make a mental exercise, to do a thought experiment where we tell ourselves everything he was not. He was not a communal leader who leads his people. He was not somebody that people came to Vilna to visit. He was not someone who fought for tolerance or who was any kind of political leader in wanting rights for the Jews. He was none of those things. What was the Gaon of Vilna? He was a genius in understanding and explaining difficult passages of the Talmud and the Kabbalah that had not been understood for hundreds of years, or in some cases thousands of years. So there are classic examples, which we can prepare for another day, where great Polish rabbis, a century before the Gaon, in Krakow or in Lublin, they had a method, a fun method called pilpul, where they would make up some nice story to explain this sentence. Nobody fooling themselves that it explains what it originally meant, but giving some explanation. The Gaon said, no, we must understand the actual text. So his main contribution was figuring out the real meaning of a completely inscrutable, incomprehensible passage in Talmud or Kabbalah. And he did so by methods that maybe are not that unusual today. He was the first to employ what we call in modern literary studies textual analysis. Now, according to the Jewish religion, the Torah, the 5 books that have to be written in the scroll by that very great learned Sofer, has no mistakes. It has, the way we have it is the Torah. There is no such tradition about the rest of the Bible, about the Mishnah, about the Gemara, about the Talmud, about the Kabbalah. So the Gaon of Vilna compared manuscripts. He compared similar passages in different manuscripts and different printed books, and he very often came to the conclusion, there's a typo, there's a mistake in this sentence, it's not clear. Now, in order to be able to do that, he had to have a phenomenal memory. We in the 21st century don't value this because we have the internet and computers, and we can quickly look up how many times a word and where it occurs in the Talmud and in what form, and so on. But in the 18th century, this power of memory of the Babylonian Talmud, and you have up there the Jerusalem Talmud, the other Talmud that was much less studied. So you had a phenomenal mind of Talmudic understanding, of fixing of faulty manuscripts, understanding of difficult texts, and teaching the truth of what these Talmudic authors meant when they wrote it. So to the modern mind, big deal. Today a computer could do it, maybe. But to the classic Jewish mind, this was the highest form of Torah scholarship, understanding the Talmud and the Kabbalah and being able to explain them, to correct them, and to establish the correct text for future generations. That's point 1. Point 2, once he was recognized as so great on point 1, that gave him authority to be a poisek, or we Litvak say pesek, that means a decider, someone higher than a rabbi who has the right to adjudicate a legalistic question, sometimes going against a rabbi from 100 years earlier. It's a legalistic literature. It's jurisprudence. When people start studying Talmud, they think they're going to find pages and pages about God and religion and the angels, and then they find pages and pages of, if a brick falls out of my window and injures someone, it fell out by accident, what percentage am I guilty? What percentage is somebody who didn't see it coming and should have been looking? It's all about law. Not all, but the big, a lot of it is law that's not even applicable, the laws of building the temple and running the temple in Jerusalem. Now, to continue about the Gaon of Vilna. The Gaon of Vilna understood, for example, that the Talmudic tractate about the laws of the seventh year, where the Bible says the land must be allowed to rest the seventh year, not be cultivated, Shemitah, that without going out into the fields and learning from some peasant something about planting and sowing and reaping, you're not going to understand what they're talking about. So that is where the Gaon said, whoever wants to study this tractate, this speciality of the Talmud, the laws of the seventh year, yes, Shvius or Shemitah, has to become an expert in agriculture. And that gave people the idea that he was a modernist who said you should study other things. More famously in astronomy. There's entire sections of the Talmud, and indeed Kabbalah, and indeed astrology, that have to do with the sun and the moon and the stars and the movements and the dates and how to calculate the Hebrew lunar calendar. It's not a real lunar calendar. It's fixed every few years by a leap year in order that Passover should still be in the spring, that the Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, should still... The Muslim lunar calendar is a real lunar calendar. Yes, Ramadan can occur in any season. So anyway, this very complicated Jewish calendar, the Gaon said, you got to study astronomy if you're going to deal with it. Okay, so among his other projects, he apparently translated a work into Hebrew. It's not the original work about the basis of astronomy. And because of this grew the legend that he was a great astronomer or that he was a great agriculturer. He also, on the laws of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, for a religious person, the coming of the Messiah and the resurrection of the dead are every bit as real as this table and the sun and the moon. And so for him to study all these details of the Talmudic instructions for rebuilding the temple, one had to study geometry, one had to study some architecture, one had to study these things. So the Gaon brought a higher level of intellectual rigor to Talmudic studies. It was less and less of rabbis sitting around trying to be clever, and more logically based study of the ancient text to understand what they meant. On the topic of religion, the Gaon was extraordinarily strict. The fact that he supported the study of astronomy, geometry, and the trigonometry, etc., had to do with Talmudic study, not because he was agreeing with the Haskalah, the modern Jews of Germany, that Jews had to stop studying Talmud and replace this study with modern studies. He hated that view, but he coincided when, for example, it is said he gave a blessing to his pupils to publish books on astronomy. I'll show you one in a little while, published by one of his pupils in Germany after being a student of the Gaon, and claiming that the Gaon told him that it's important and necessary to do. So that's another way in which he was important. So we've mentioned so far, the main thing is his intellectual ability and memory with understanding the text of the Talmud and Kabbalah. Second, the authority to pass judgment on Jewish law based on the first. Third, his understanding of the need for certain modern studies in order to accomplish the foregoing. Those were three things of the Gaon of Vilna. The Gaon of Vilna during his lifetime wrote only one thing, I'll call it the thing, essay, that's not this obscurantist Hebrew, Aramaic, Talmudic, Kabbalistic notes that he writes 3 words and it takes a great Talmudist today to know what the heck he's saying. This is the letter he wrote to his family, to his wife and children, it's now called Igeres HaGro, the missive, the letter of the Gro. The story that he tells there is that he had planned to leave his family and move to the Holy Land to fulfill the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. Something happened, we don't know what, and he didn't make it, and he returned. But before he returned, he had written this document telling his family how to live. Okay, so many modern people, everybody should read it. It's translated into many languages, for sure English. And I'll give you a few of the statements from this book, and I think people might be shocked. If you can pray at home, it's much better, and avoid the synagogue. If you go to the synagogue, you'll be overcome with perhaps jealousy of other people who dress better or are more clever, have a better voice, whatever. You may become sexually attracted to someone that minute and not be thinking of the prayers. You may do something that's the worst thing of all. You will get involved in gossip about somebody. And then he goes through similar things. If you can educate your children at home, if you have the money to educate them at home, much better to educate them at home than to have them running around the school and getting the worst as well as the best from other people. So the Gaon of Vilna became known as a recluse, as a hermit, that in his little apartment in Yiddish Gas, in the Jewish quarter, near the Shulif, nobody could get near him. In fact, the only picture we have of the Goyen that was drawn during his lifetime was drawn by a Catholic Polish student at what is now Vilnius University, who was fascinated. Who is this great rabbi that Jews come from all around the world to see, and they don't get to see him because he has no time to waste? Okay. So according to this story, this student waited in the backyard where every human being has to go out to the facilities that were outside. And we have this drawing. I'll show you a copy inside. It's completely, I believe it's authentic and very different from all the fake drawings from the 19th century and 20th that are based on a German Jewish rabbi with fancy hat and fancy things. He has nothing but the prayer shawl over his head. So the lore of the Gaon, the folklore, became the folklore of the Litvak, that the Litvak is learned, the Litvak is honest, but the Litvak is not very sociable. The Litvak wants to work his whole life and study and considers it a waste of time to have fun with people. So there's all kinds of stories. One of the most famous is, and it may be apocryphal, but it doesn't matter, it goes to the image of the Vilna Gaon. He had a sister who lived somewhere far, and he hadn't seen her for dozens of years, and when she was old and ill, she came to see him for the last time. And he wrote her a beautiful letter explaining that he can't take time off the study of Torah, of the holy books, and they will have plenty of time to meet and speak in the world to come. That is a true story, whether it's historical or not, because that is the Vilna Gaon, to sit alone. He didn't make a yeshiva in his life. He didn't make an academy. In his later years, he had around his table around 7 students. So the Gaon developed this obsession with study and knowledge that in the modern period was, of course, sometimes reinterpreted to science or to math or to history or to poetry or to some other concern. But it's the certain fanaticism of don't waste time with social things. When he was older and he needed to sleep more, he fought this intention by forcing himself to stay up and to study with his feet in cold water. Again, we don't know if some of these stories are exaggerated, but they explain accurately the matter.